Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Josh Lipsky. I'm the Director of Programs and Policy for Global Business and Economics at the Atlantic Council. We're so pleased to host today's event in cooperation with Macro Polo think tank, part of the Paulson Institute in Chicago. And really, our collaboration with Macro Polo fits because both of us are trying to look past the current economic crisis and look forward to the shape of the global economy, not just for the year ahead, but for the decade ahead. And that's why we're so excited about today's event and why we think it's so timely. Because today we're going to be talking about supply chains. And it's something everyone has been talking about since the onset of COVID-19. But I think few people have fully understood and really unpacked with the nuance it deserves. And the conversation you so often hear is that, oh, supply chains are going to be reshored and we're going to bring back manufacturing. But as we'll talk about today, and as Damien Ma, director of the Macro Polo think tank, and his colleague Neil Thomas have written about, it's actually a more complicated question. Supply chains are sticky. It's hard when businesses have invested decades in a certain way of doing things to just re-up them and take away what's been done. So that's going to be what we'll talk about today. And it's part of an ongoing conversation we're going to be having at the Atlantic Council throughout the summer. We're calling it the Summer of Supply Chains. And we're going to be talking about supply chains and trade throughout the coming months, including by hosting the Director General of the WTO, Roberto Azevedo, in July. So we hope you all stay tuned for that, stay tuned to our programming, and we want you to join in this conversation today. So you have the Q&A function on Zoom that you can use, and please submit your questions. We want this to be interactive and engaging, and if you're watching on social media, please tweet us at Atlantic Council and at Macro Polo, and we're gonna get to your questions. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator for today, Anna Swanson, trade and international economics reporter for the New York Times. We really could not have a better host and leader of this event today. Anna's written extensively about the Chinese economy, the US economy, the global economy, and understands these issues well. So Anna, thank you for being part of this. Thank you for doing this, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this very timely event today and giving me a reason to change out of my work from home sweatshirt uniform as well. This is a great moment to have a conversation about supply chains because this phrase, as you were saying, seems to be on everybody's lips. Company executives and analysts are talking about the supply chain frailties that have been revealed by the pandemic. And in Washington, both Trump administration officials and lawmakers of both parties are ramping up efforts to try to reshore supply chains, especially for critical goods like masks and medicines and semiconductors. But as you were saying, I think there's also a lot that is misunderstood about supply chains. They're invisible, they're often proprietary. In my experience, sometimes companies don't even understand the depths of their own supply chains, much less DC politicians. So I'm really delighted that we can dig into this subject today with three people who know a lot about how supply chains operate, especially for high-tech goods, and who have a lot of insight into what growing tensions between the United States and China mean for global business and innovation. So let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Damien Ma, the director of Macro Polo. We also have Mian Oh, the director and senior fellow of the Atlantic Council's Asia Security Initiative. And finally, Neil Thomas, senior research associate at Macro Polo. So Damien, let me start with you. There is a lot of discussion about the need to reshore manufacturing that has gone overseas among Trump administration officials and on Capitol Hill, and about how the pandemic will serve as this catalyst for reshoring. But company decisions aren't necessarily dictated by Congress and the White House. Do you think companies are listening to what politicians are saying? Can companies really quit China? And from your understanding, what are the lessons that companies are actually drawing from the pandemic about the vulnerabilities in their supply chains and the changes they might need to make in the future, if any?
Well, thank you, Anna. And first of all, I want to thank Josh and the Atlantic Council. It's our first joint webinar together, so it's great. And we used to like to say always that a summer in Chicago is the best summer, but a summer of supply chain sounds even better to me. So it's great that we're going to have a summer of supply chains here. And to your question, Anna, which I think are really good ones, I think. From our vantage point, there's a lot of political rhetoric. There's a lot of politics around supply chains, and I want to bring in a bit more kind of the economic side of things and the commercial aspects. So in thinking about COVID's impact, I think this is a very simple observation, but I also think it's been missing in the conversation. What's affected by COVID is human activity, but it didn't destroy any physical assets, right? Supply chains are basically physical assets. They're still there. So the capital expenditure there is, which is why there's some reason why it's been more resilient than people think. So if you were to ask maybe a Silicon Valley venture capitalist, one solution to mitigate some of the risk is maybe just have more robots and fewer humans in the supply chain. That could be a solution coming out of Silicon Valley. But I think what I want to talk about here in terms of the stickiness of supply chains is this idea of ecosystems that can be applied to a lot of different things. But I do think the ecosystem, which economists tend to kind of have done a lot of study called the agglomeration effect, which Paul Krugman has done a lot on. The end result of that is just a very robust ecosystem that's sprung out of East Asia. It's not just China, it's Japan, it's South Korea. And that is a very, very powerful force. And it's very hard to switch out of that. And let me make another kind of simplified analogy. Most consumers individually, you're either an Android person or an iOS person. But most people don't even want to switch from Android to iOS. Why? Because Android is its own ecosystem, and there's a switching cost, which is your time. So think about that multiplied by 150 times, 200 times complexity with an actual high-tech supply chain that's built up over decades. So, and companies are in the driver's seat. They're the ones that built it. It's not governments, right? So companies know that best. So the switching cost there is enormous. And if anything, if you're looking at what's happening post-COVID is, what are the economies that have emerged fastest and the best out of it? It's Taiwan and South Korea, it's Japan and it's China. Happens to be the East Asian supply chain that's done really well. So I think the bottom line here is we're actually seeing probably more resilience in the high-tech supply chain than fragility. Now, that is not to say there isn't any risk. There always is risk inherent in any global supply chain. But I think it's a bit counterintuitive for us to actually think about resilience rather than fragility of the supply chains.
Great. Mian, let me go to you to follow up on that. Do you also see supply chains being resilient? Damien mentioned the pandemic has affected people, not physical assets. So what kind of disruptions have we actually seen so far in global supply chains? And are companies taking a different view on the risks about global supply chains after the pandemic? Do you think that they're receptive to any of the government's efforts here to try to bring manufacturing back to the United States or at least move it out of China?
Thank you, Anna. And also thank you, Josh, for having me here today. So what I see is that global economy faces strategic uncertainty now, mainly due to three elements. And number one, there's a changed view and skepticism in terms of globalization and trade. And two, new technological advancements that have changed the conceptions of national security. And three, intensifying US-China tensions and signs of decoupling. So due to this strategic uncertainty, global supply chains are facing more non-market risk, such as export control, protectionism, and political actions by nation state, and also this kind of unexpected crisis such as COVID-19. I don't think COVID-19 itself alone has changed firms' views and strategies, but COVID-19 together with the trade war and worsening US-China tensions and signs of decoupling are affecting firms' views and vulnerability with regard to the global supply chains. And I agree with Damien. So 3 decades ago, firms, chose where to manufacture and outsource based on market factors, which is mainly cost. And then trade war brought a new dimension of non-market risk into the equation, which is geopolitical risk and risk associated with national security, which I just mentioned. And this COVID-19 brings additional non-market dimension, and which is resilience. And there are some studies like Kearney argue that global manufacturing is moving away from China, and financial analysis also noted that the US tech sector remain most vulnerable due to potential decoupling, as they are so dependent on supply chains in China and with their revenue exposure. However, reallocating global supply chain is not an easy task, but a long-term and expensive one. And also companies has different interests, which Josh also laid out at the beginning, sometimes conflicting and converging when doing business with China. And according to American Chamber survey, the majority of U.S. firms operating in China don't plan to move production and supply chains out of China. For instance, Apple is a good case of showing why some U.S. firms are not only staying in China, but also increasing and deepen their presence in China. So Apple is working with Chinese company called Luxshare, and basically they offers lower prices with competitive quality, and it could help Apple further deepen their presence in the huge Chinese market. And there are also companies, US companies like Intel and Starbucks. It's not a high tech, but still they're increasing their investment in China. And among the non-US firms, there are Nestle and Adidas who are increasing their investment even despite of the COVID-19 crisis. And on the other hand, just going back to your questions, there are firms that are more receptive to the administration's effort in terms of reshoring plan. And for example, the US semiconductor industry, they're ramping up to lobby the major funding, which is $37 billion, in order to help maintain the US edge over China and other countries whose government are subsidizing firms in order to compete against the United States. So this plan seems to be very well suited to what we're hearing in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. focusing on economic competition with China and specific industries, high tech, they will lose its leverage and market share if the U.S. government did not step in to help them compete against unfair Chinese practices. This is what they're thinking. So in closing, I would say that global supply chains are developed geographically based on specialization, and their reallocation requires high capital expenditure upfront. Little study so far exists in terms of costs and benefits associated with supply chain modification and the lead time involved, and even whether the restructuring actually provides greater security of supply chains. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, great. I do want to bring Neil in on this. So Damien emphasized resilience in supply chains, and Mian highlighted some of the disruptions and vulnerabilities that might be causing a longer term rethink. So where do you come in on that? And then do you think reshoring is a realistic or worthwhile goal? And what do you think policymakers might need to do if they actually want to entice factories away from China? So it seems like there has been this shift in Washington to embrace the idea of greater funding and limited industrial plans to counter China. But does Chinese-style industrial policy offer any cautionary tales that the United States should be thinking about in terms of overcapacity or inefficiency when we think about bringing supply chains back to the United States?
Thanks, Anna. A great set of questions. I think that the current debates about reshoring do reflect some very valid concerns, particularly about the negative impact that economic globalization has had on certain sectors of the American economy, an impact that was unfortunately overlooked for many years. But leading on from what Damien and Yeon have been saying, I think given the profit incentives that firms face in market economies, the goal of reshoring outsourced production back to America itself is often very difficult to achieve, given that it would involve prohibitive costs and would stifle new industries. And the fact that it hasn't been happening for the last few decades is kind of evidence on its face of the costs involved. And that's why we've actually seen that most of the firms that have moved out of China or have diversified some of their supply chains out of China have not moved back to America, but most of them have moved to other low-cost manufacturing hubs that currently offer greater political security, such as Vietnam or Mexico. And Yeon has rightly pointed out how a lot of American firms across many different business surveys, America, Australia, Europe, plan to stay in the China market, whether that's international supply chains or China for China supply chains. But I think in terms of how to, if the goal is to reshore production or to maintain America's leading role in advanced industries, one option would, of course, be to offer enormous cost subsidies for firms to relocate specifically back to America. But I think the amount of money involved in that would be too much for even Congress to countenance. So I think what you noted in terms of the more favorable attitude towards industrial policy in Washington is very prescient. Although it is important to note again that the United States has always had government policies that encourage the development of certain domestic industries. I mean, agriculture, finance, steel are all prominent examples. And what we see now is a recognition that Beijing's state-led approach to subsidizing strategic industries has helped China to create a world-class tech sector. But this process isn't wholly dissimilar from the role that the American government played in fostering, say, internet technologies many decades ago. But the cautionary note in terms of how to go about optimizing a new form of industrial policy is to focus on innovation and basic research to target that funding. Because flooding industrial firms with easy money is something that was a part of China's $4 trillion stimulus plan after the global financial crisis. And while that had some great macroeconomic effects for China, it created issues of overcapacity, inefficiency, and financial risk that Beijing is still trying to undo now, more than 10 years later.
Great. So it does seem like that conversation around incentives is particularly focused right now in Washington on semiconductors, which we'll talk more about later. But yesterday, another major piece of legislation introduced by Tom Cotton and Chuck Schumer to subsidize that industry. So it does seem like, at least on semiconductors, there is some movement in that direction. Let me go back to Mian again. I want to talk about China emerging from the pandemic. So for China being an authoritarian surveillance state, particularly has some drawbacks, but getting rid of a pandemic doesn't seem to be one of them. The U.S. is experiencing another major surge in coronavirus cases right now, but China has moved very swiftly to lock down local outbreaks, and it's in a position now to be the first major global economy that's back up and running. So what do you think are the long-term consequences of that? Do you think we'll see China try to take advantage of this moment and boost its trade and investment and gain more market share in other countries to offset the risks of decoupling for the United States? And how could that leave the U.S. vis-a-vis China?
Thank you, Anna. And I agree with you. I think that is right. So although China has yet to return to business as usual, China will likely be the first critical link in reviving the global and regional economy as it begins to restore its supply chains. So with this development, companies that were trying to reduce their heavy reliance on China due to the US-China trade war, they cannot help but reverse their move to keep their supply chains open and operating. And we can see the McKinsey report, someone said that coronavirus shock will restructure global supply chains with production moving closer to markets. And China is close to Asian markets and economies where high-tech industries and manufacturing are located. So I would say I would like to talk about the major economies, which is Japan and South Korea, as an example, because it is critical for countries like Japan and Korea, which also Damon mentioned earlier, whose high-tech electronics and auto industry were hit by COVID-19, and to promote recovery in their key industries, and as well because their financial markets continue to reel. Firms from these countries are facing the dilemma that U.S. government drive to restructure the global supply chain, so-called economic prosperity network. And the thing is, while these countries realize that over-reliance on a single country is a huge strategic mistake, but they cannot help but reserve their move to keep their supply chains open and operating for the time being. So moving out of China will be difficult for their high-tech business, given the benefits being close to other stages of supply chains and staying close to a key market that they service. Also, it is just not about making things in China, but also it is about selling things in China. So far, Japan said that it will support U.S. government effort to reorganize strategic supply chains to bypass China, and Korea has not made any statement to join the effort to shift supply chains out of China. But again, how and whether firms are going to join such effort will be much more challenging and complicated than government statement. And really quickly on your final question. So as soon as China returns to business as usual, it is likely that Beijing will offer diplomatic and economic incentive to restore and boost its trade and investment with its neighboring countries to offset the risk of decoupling from the United States and also give itself more leverage in its strategic competition with Washington, I think. And just one example quickly, China allowed the entry of 200 Samsung engineers to come to the country, making an exception to its ban of foreigners despite of the pandemic lockdown, because they're working on the expansion of the semiconductor plant in Xi'an. So this is what I think they will try to doing, and in order to keep their leverage.
That's a very interesting example. I wasn't aware of that Samsung example. Thank you. So we are getting some good audience questions in right now. And so I just want to remind you that you can go to the chat function and submit questions and answers there. You'll also see a link to the article and report that Damien and Neil have put out about supply chains. So Damien, I want to turn to you to talk about one of the case studies that you have in that report about Tesla. So Tesla obviously has important facilities in both the United States and China. And in the US, it's the foundation of the lithium-ion battery industry, which you say in the report is one of those sectors that could be as critical to the 21st century economy as steel and oil and cement were to the last century. So why did you see Tesla as an interesting example? What does Tesla have to tell us about how the strategic competition between the United States and China is playing out, and the kinds of opportunities and challenges that multinationals like Tesla face when they want to have a foothold in both the United States and in China?
Thanks. Tesla is a very interesting case, and it actually ties what you asked Neil about industrial policy with Mian said about the end market, right? So Tesla, I would argue, is actually a fairly successful story of U.S. industrial policy, because I think people forget in its on initial stages, it actually got a loan from the Department of Energy for it to kind of survive and keep on scaling up. And now it has scaled up, and it's in China for a lot of reasons, but one of which is that China happens to be the biggest EV market right now. And so supply chains tend to migrate toward where end demand is the most robust, as Mian had already said. And so there's no other bigger market right now for EVs except for China. And another important factor is that for the first time in many decades, China has allowed a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, a WOFE, to be set up in the auto sector, which for a long time it was always 50-50 JVs. So you couldn't go in alone if you were a foreign auto manufacturer, but they allowed Tesla to go in alone. And obviously you see how fast they were able to build out a gigafactory there. So I think the scale there is really important. And the interesting thing about Tesla too, if folks recall, for a while there, the financial markets were very much, they did not have a bullish view of Tesla. I think there were a lot of short sellers trying to, say that, Tesla was overvalued, or that it may be a fraud. It wasn't going to do it. And then, which is interesting because that's counter to national. If we define our national interest in if the interest is in having lithium-ion battery manufacturing in the United States, Tesla is the only player in town that's doing that. So if you look at our data, U.S. is about 10% of global lithium-ion battery market share. That 10% is almost entirely Tesla. China is 60% in terms of batteries, right? So Tesla is the only game in town. So there's a dissonance between what the markets were saying and what kind of our national interest may be if we wanted to have lithium-ion batteries. So it's interesting what Tesla is doing. I can't read their mind. I don't know their strategy per se, but based on what I'm looking at is, I think they're essentially trying to build out a parallel vertically integrated supply chain in China. That's kind of very similar to what they already have in the United States. And that could be a possible strategy forward in mitigating supply chain risk, is that maybe, next, in the future, they're going to build out a parallel vertical supply chain in the European market, because that's another big EV market. already has a fairly developed manufacturing ecosystem. So you kind of have vertical integration in these markets that have strong ecosystems and a little bit parallel across the board because it's the same company. So that might be a way. So for example, if the European one goes down or gets disrupted, you still have the China one and you still have the US one. Again, I'm not saying that's what Tesla's thinking, but it looks like that's what they're trying to do in Shanghai and in China. And so that could be a potential strategy going forward. And that's why we found it to be interesting in both as sort of the only player that's at scale in the United States. And it's also in China, and it's probably gonna, and it's a cautionary tale of if we don't get the incentives right, Tesla could, switch to a Chinese battery supplier, CATL, which is now the world's largest battery maker, and they make batteries that are probably just as good as Panasonic, which is what Tesla has been using. So,
great, that's really interesting. So it's a question of getting those incentives right. Neil, I wanted to go to you and ask a similar question about the semiconductor industry, which is another one of the case studies in your great report, and particularly the kind of chips that are enabling artificial intelligence. So what are AI chips, for some people in the audience that are maybe less informed, and why are they so important? Where does that strategic competition for that technology stand right now? And then have there been any recent actions by the Trump administration or Congress that would put a scale in favor of put a finger on the scale in favor of the United States when it comes to competition over that industry? Or is competition even the right sort of framework, I guess, to look at this industry? Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, so AI chips are just semiconductor chips that are specifically designed to support artificial intelligence technologies. It's like image recognition, natural language processing, autonomous driving. These are really complex, non-routine computing tasks, and they just require chips that are more powerful and more efficient, and that are optimized for the kind of the big data and parallel matrix computation that are required by the most advanced machine learning algorithms that underpin artificial intelligence. And these chips are so important because AI technology is really at the forefront of not just commercial innovation in emerging industries like advanced smartphones or autonomous vehicles. It's also at the forefront of military applications such as drone warfare and cybersecurity. And these AI chips, are the hardware that ultimately powers this technology. So they really are incredibly important for the future of innovation. And the rapid rise of AI means that these AI chips are predicted to comprise up to 20% of what's already about a $450 billion market as early as 2025. And right now, Chinese firms, especially Huawei, are investing really heavily in their capabilities to design cutting-edge AI chips. But the West really still maintains a strategic advantage in AI chip supply chains, mostly due to its longer history of semiconductor innovation and its resulting dominance of key inputs. So for instance, in last year, 2019, the top 15 semiconductor companies in the world by revenue, they're all from the US, South Korea, Japan, Europe, and also Taiwan, with Huawei's chip subsidiary HiSilicon coming in at 16th. But perhaps more importantly, looking at the overall supply chain, about 75% of revenues for a core underlying chip IP goes to the US and the UK. And this is data from our supply chain report. About 80% of the semiconductor manufacturing equipment industry, so the machines that make these really complex, really tiny chips and their transistors, 80% is in the US, Japan, and the Netherlands. And 70% of all contract chip manufacturing is performed by one company in Taiwan, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. So we see that Chinese firms, particularly Huawei, are at the cutting edge of designing AI chips, but it's still they're at least a few years behind the curve in actually making these chips. So in terms of recent policy actions that have been taken in Washington, we saw last month there was new regulations released that would give the Commerce Department effective veto power over the export of any chips that include US technology inputs to Huawei in particular. So that's going to make it very difficult for Huawei, at least in the short term, to source the kind of cutting edge chips that it basically gets from TSMC, from Taiwan. And all we've seen TSMC is complying with this regulation, and there haven't been obvious workarounds that have come to light just yet. So in the short term, this policy will make it difficult for Chinese firms, but in the longer term, it's a less certain bet because it's also going to have an impact on the ability of American firms to sell into China, which means less revenue, less reinvestment in their own capital and innovation, research and development. So the bet is that America can out-innovate China over the next 5, 10, many decades in the future. And that is not a foregone conclusion. A much surer bet, though, in terms of maintaining America's leading position in semiconductor supply chains is to really invest in American innovation, invest in American education, research, to maintain that lead, no matter what's happening in China. And in this respect, as you mentioned earlier, there's been significant action from Congress in recent days and weeks, including a $25 billion roughly bill and funding and tax credits to bolster domestic semiconductor production. So I'd expect those types of bills to receive wider and wider support on Capitol Hill.
And Anna, I just want to add one very quick point. I think it's important to kind of maybe give people a sense of kind of just the capex cost of some semiconductors, because I think it's a really, really expensive venture. And one of my favorite data points that we found is one of the critical machines that a Dutch company, ASML, makes. They kind of monopolize it. It's very much, you can't make advanced chips without it. It's a photolithography machine. But the price tag on one of those machines is $120 million, which is the price of a Boeing 737. And you need a bunch of those machines in a semiconductor fab to actually, do the work. So that's the kind of price tag we're talking about. So when you think about reshoring, putting in new capex, I mean, it is not cheap at all.
Right. Yeah, that's a huge barrier to entry, and certainly you could see potentially a role for government subsidies or funding maybe there. Well, Damien, let me stick with you, and I want to ask you about an issue that comes up a lot actually when politicians are discussing ways to incentivize or regulate the semiconductor industry. And that is, I know in your writing you brought up this really interesting quandary where US policymakers, by trying to shut China out of certain high-tech markets entirely, might end up eliminating a considerable source of revenue for multinational firms. And some argue that by shutting multinational firms out of China, you take away their ability to invest in the next generation of technology, you take away important markets for them, and therefore you hamstring US efforts to innovate. So do you agree with that? Do you think there's necessarily a trade-off between national security and the kind of openness that the United States prizes? And how do you go about protecting national security without undermining the strength of multinational companies? Is that possible?
Yeah, no, that's a terrific question, and I think that's the heart of kind of a lot of these debates. I don't think it's necessarily a trade-off. I would probably characterize it as finding that optimal balance of how to protect critical national security, which is obviously crucial and important, but also how to not to, for a lack of a better term, shoot ourselves in the foot, so that we can also continue to lead in breakthrough innovation. A lot of these products that we looked at, the advanced OLED glass displays or semiconductors, I mean, these things are, 20-30% of corporate revenue goes to kind of R&D, internal corporate R&D. So it's a pretty significant amount. And so they need to have profit and revenue to be able to fund the next breakthrough technology, which we don't know when it will happen. It takes a long time for that kind of stuff to happen. Everyone's been waiting for the lithium ion battery to have breakthrough innovation. That hasn't happened for 20 years. It's been kind of, it's been improving, but we haven't had a really true breakthrough there for a long time. And so, the reason that, for example, everyone knows the iPhone screen has Gorilla Glass, right? That unbreakable glass that's made by a U.S. company, Corning. Well, Corning spends 20 times more in R&D than its Japanese competitors. And so that's significant. So they need revenue to be able to do the next breakthrough. And frankly, a lot of innovation comes from collaboration across borders, across companies, and perhaps not across companies, but it's a fairly open collaborative system to have true innovation. So, and I think even the Pentagon not too long ago came out saying sort of, companies need revenue to be able to drive the next breakthrough. Where I think it's possible for U.S. government to think about is how to kind of better fund the commercialization aspect of innovation. If there's a product, the internet is a good example where the internet was invented by the U.S. government, but it didn't really take hold until the private sector took it and made it what it is today. And so there's a lot of examples there where a lot of possibly innovative new products that are coming out of basic research or the corporate side, or there's just not enough money to commercialize it. And I think where China really is able to do right now, I think better than us, is commercialize things very quickly because they have scale. And that is something we need to think hard about how to incentivize that and how to do that better.
Great. That's really interesting. So we do have some good audience questions, but before we go to those, I want to quickly ask you guys about a little more of a political approach. So what do you think the upcoming election means for some of these questions? Do you have any thoughts on what a second Trump presidency would mean for U.S.-China relations versus a Biden presidency? Do we know what Joe Biden thinks about global supply chains? Maybe I could start with Mian quickly and then go to Neil and Damien if you're interested in adding some thoughts there.
Thank you, Anna. So since I think that there will be the continuation of the current policy, so I'd like to touch upon what Biden's policy would look like. And we know that medical supply chain is his component of official COVID-19 plan, to be sure, but I'd like to say that it is unclear exactly how Biden would approach the question of global supply chains more broadly under his trade platform. And Biden is also taking strong stance on China and has emphasized that repairing U.S. relationship with allies and partners to coordinate a multilateral response to China's abusive behavior. And we also know that he has said that he would be willing to renegotiate TPP as a part of a broader effort to put pressure on China and to change its behavior. This focus on a U.S. return to more multilateral economic effort might, I think, create space for a coordinated effort to implement incentives to diversify global supply chains that we talk about, and reduction of trade barriers as part of a major multilateral deal might also aid these efforts. And at the same time, if a more multilateral approach means he would be more hesitant to employ tariff, export controls, or any other carrot and stick measures to move supply chains, we might see a reversal of some of the Trump administration's more recent efforts, even if Biden still wants to ban companies like Huawei from building critical U.S. infrastructure.
Okay. Neil or Damien, are you interested in taking a stab at that?
I don't have any insight into what will happen under a second Trump or a new Biden administration. All I'll say is that whatever happens, I do hope and I do hope that the basic U.S. strategy is more about thinking much harder about how to make the U.S. economy much more competitive in this new global environment, rather than focus our efforts on trying to shut out or protect other, to kind of get China or whatever the country may be out of the current supply chains. Because I think as long as we become more resilient, more competitive in this environment, I'm not sure we need to worry that much about the rest. It becomes less important. So that's what I would hope the basic U.S. strategy would be, whatever the case.
Yeah, I think I'd agree that we'll see there'd be differences in approaches. But I think the underlying trend, though, will be strong towards a lot more policy attention being focused on supply chains, which really have been flying under the radar for the last 20, 30 plus years after the end of the Cold War. And so there's obviously better ways than others to go about improving America's position in supply chains. But I think regardless of what happens in November, we're going to see an increasing focus on them and increasing government resources and expertise going towards these supply chain issues.
Okay, great. All right, let me throw in a few audience questions. This one obviously comes from an audience member who's very informed on trade because they mentioned the generalized system of preferences, which provides duty-free treatment to goods from certain countries. But they want to ask the panelists, how likely is it that we will see low-value manufacturing accelerate its move toward lower cost production bases like Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, which some of you have mentioned here in this panel today, in the years to come? And what do you think a Biden administration might do to support or change that trend? So there are a few different policy options on the table. For one, there's the tariffs that the Trump administration has put in place on China. Do you think that's something, that President Biden would keep on or remove? She also mentions adding apparel to the generalized system of preferences here, or joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is something that, of course, President Trump pulled the United States out of, but Obama and Biden were supportive of previously. So whoever wants to jump in here, we can just have a free-for-all. Hopefully not talk over each other too much.
Well, I'll just speak very briefly. There was a lot there, but on the question about whether low-cost manufacturing might continue to migrate out of China, I think that's certainly possible. And what you're actually seeing is a lot of diversification is actually from Chinese firms themselves, and they're going to Vietnam or Southeast Asia, and then they're selling it back to China anyway. I think it's important to keep in mind that people are in China now not simply because of the cost. China has it's a developing country, but it has first world infrastructure and logistics. It's very easy to get things from point A to point B. And so it's also about the efficiency of the system. Going back to the whole ecosystem concept, it's a very robust, efficient system now that Southeast Asia just simply cannot compete. And so if the idea is, again, to kind of sell back into China, then I think companies have to make judgments about whether it makes sense to go to Vietnam just for the cost and then sell it back to China, or kind of maybe go to Western China or other parts of China to kind of stay in China, but to continue to sell to China. So I think that is a very much of a case by case judgment. But again, based on the numbers, we're not seeing a mass migration into Southeast Asia. Although Mia might be able to talk about maybe the Japanese and South Korean companies are doing more of that than perhaps even the Western or Chinese companies.
Yeah, Mia, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so here on, I think that I can share some countries in Asia who think and trying to benefit out of the current U.S. government effort to restructure the global supply chains and reduce their reliance on China. So like Damien mentioned, like India, Vietnam, Taiwan, Malaysia, and those are the countries that trying to, again, benefit from the US-China trade war, and in order to attract some firms that are moving their production line out of China. So first example would be India, and they're developing an area of land bigger than New York to attract business coming out of China, and they launch a plan to offer financial incentive of $7 billion, and out of that, 25% is capital expenditure. They have they said that they're going to place, and they have a plan to recruit 5 big global companies manufacturing mobile phones and related components. So we Neil and Damien talk a lot about like government subsidies, incentives. So I think this would be some of the cases that other Southeast Asia countries are doing with regard to the current situation. But not even with that, US tech leaders such as Microsoft and Google, they're also stepping up their effort to reallocate production of new devices from China, potentially to Vietnam and Thailand. But I'd like to note that this has started before the coronavirus and after the trade war has started. And according to there is a World Bank survey, and out of like 33 companies as of October 2019, 23 companies moved to China, and the rest relocating to Malaysia and Thailand and Cambodia. So I think that this is a interesting example. And as we know well, that Taiwan has been at the forefront of cooperating with the United States to shift supply chains out of China. And we know that there's ongoing discussion in terms of bilateral FTA between the United States and Taiwan. So this could be related or unrelated, but TSMC decided to build a new plant of $12 billion in Arizona, United States, and also like other Taiwanese company like Quanta Computer, which is world third largest electronic manufacturing services that supplies data center to Facebook and Google. So one example, that increasing their investment in Taiwan in order to reduce their reliance on China, at the same time to boost the government's relocalization efforts. So I think there are some interesting examples.
I would just add quickly on the issue of the TPP. I think Damien and Mia have covered the other issues really well. But it's a difficult issue politically in the United States, but from the perspective of American allies and partners in the region, I'm from Australia, so I'm also following these debates pretty closely. Generally a pretty bipartisan issue in those countries that the TPP or something very much like it is the preferred approach to these, international economic issues from regional partners. But whether it's going to make sense from an American political perspective, that's to be determined. And obviously, we'll see more discussion about that in the months to come.
Neil, we did have an audience question asking whether we think the U.S. withdrawal from the TPP potentially slowed the move of supply chains out of China, since this removed tariff incentives for moving to other Asian countries. Do you have any quick thoughts on that question? What do you think the U.S. withdrawal from TPP meant for some of these supply chains?
Yeah, it's difficult to model something that didn't happen, but in terms of the kind of high quality provisions with regard to environmental standards, labor standards, procurement, state-owned enterprises, and their relationship with the market, I think you'd have had a regional trade bloc, which is being kept alive by the other participants. You'd have had a trade bloc that did have higher standards. So it's an open question as to whether the advantages from conforming to those standards would outweigh some of the, just economic pure cost advantages of maintaining, the existing supply chains in and close to China. But I think you probably would have seen some effect in that direction.
Okay, great. And I know some of you have written about China's Belt and Road Initiative and the Digital Silk Road component. So we did have one audience member who was curious how coronavirus-related disruptions have impacted those efforts by China, if at all. Do any of you have any thoughts on that? The impact on the Belt and Road and the Digital Silk Road?
Mian, maybe you do. I haven't written too much on it, but
Okay. Yeah, I think I can jump here. And I think my answer also could be related to, there's a question particularly directed me from Charles Zachary. So maybe I can try to combine my answers.
Great.
So of course, what I'm hearing from Chinese scholars that they are trying to, reflecting and what are the struggles and what are the challenges that the country is facing, and that regard to the Belt and Road project. But at the same time, I think we have to note that during the May 2020 National People's Congress, China announced that the government will invest $2 trillion into high-tech infrastructure development, which is part of the Digital Silk Road, I think. And that includes 5G, AI, big data, and electric vehicles. So the primary aim of this plan is to reduce China's reliance on imported components and strengthen its know-how in high-tech manufacturing. And China even requires factories in China to purchase at least 70% of core components from local factories by 2025. So I guess this is also part of their Made in China 2025, but they're really trying to increase and keep their leverage in terms of this U.S.-China technology competition. And I'd like to actually echo what Damien and Neil said in terms of the incentive. So for example, Huawei, Asia Security Initiative that I'm directing, we hosted a panel early this month on U.S.-China economic competition, and we talk about Huawei. And the panel seemed to agree that there seems to be a loophole in the current policy on Huawei, because it is really not trying to, it is not clear to see what the administration is trying to achieve in the end. And I really agree with Damien's point on the difficulty and dilemma the firm is having in terms of optimum balance. So I really think about this economic security and national security. And so for firms, economic security is vital to ensure, but national security, I think, is different. So think about how many firms can actually ensure and satisfy both factor, both elements, and especially given the huge upfront capital cost. So I think that what U.S. can do and has to do is put more money through Congress, and which already our panel discussed, through Congress into R&D to offer viable alternative solution to Huawei in terms of telecom equipment, because I really think that as long as Huawei it's offering cheap and relatively okay quality, the market is going to sell and buy their equipment. So that's what I really would like to say. And so again, so U.S. I think must step up its effort to coordinate its allies and partners, and it might be time to reevaluate its protectionist trade policy and export control, driven by, again, the skepticism in terms of globalization. And this approach so far, before COVID-19, I think might have helped U.S. gain advantage in its economic competition with China. But this policy have damaged to some extent Washington's relationship with the allies and partners, as well as in standing as a global leader. And I will stop here.
Okay, great. I think that segues into another nice audience question we got that's kind of broad, but a great question, which is just, can the panelists comment on differing approaches that the United States could take to reshoring supply chains? So do you think the United States is better served by taking an incentive-based approach through things like investment or R&D tax credits, or a punitive one using things like export controls or tariffs? And so we have touched on that a little bit. Damien talked a bit about the importance of investment in R&D, but could you talk a little bit more about that? And then, so do you think that, some measures, more punitive measures like export controls or tariffs, are effective in accomplishing some of these goals? And how should the U.S. look to balance those incentives for reshoring?
Well, I'll just briefly talk about that, and I hope Neil and Mian can weigh in. But when I talked about supply chains kind of just naturally migrate toward end markets. So going back to the Tesla example, the reason it's there because China again now is the biggest electric vehicles market. And how that happened was because the Chinese government was very good at creating you can call them artificial markets via subsidies. Government procurement. They made a bunch of, they basically bought a bunch of EVs and made them into taxi fleets, or they bought a bunch of buses. So they artificially induced a market at the same time they were pursuing production side policy. Now that may be a harder sell in a U.S. system in creating kind of these markets, but it is something to think about. Is sort of, if you want supply chains to naturally come back, you got to figure out how to create the markets here. So if you want Tesla will stay, if there's going to be a much bigger market, people buying EVs, it makes a lot more sense for them to manufacture here. It will be cheaper at the end of the day too. So I think that's one option that we haven't thought very clearly about, that we could think about. What are the tools there, in kind of maybe it's through government procurement, maybe it's through something else. But that's certainly something that would help dramatically incentivize from an economic commercial perspective to get companies to come back to the United States.
Great. Neil, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would like to I'll just quickly mention. So, Anna, you talk about what is really going on the Congress, and additionally, we hear that like the Beat China Act, right? Bring entrepreneur advancement to consumers here in North America. It was also announced, and DFC issue loans originating from like 100 billion pool to support project in response to COVID-19. So what I would like to say that at least the market and totally agree with Damon again, and also from the region, both government and companies, I think they're really trying to understand whether there is a campaign mottos or what the policy is going to implement it, and if so, what is the end goals, and also what is the transition strategy. So right now it is not clear, okay, so we're going to join the US government drive to restructure the global supply chains, but what are the costs and benefit, and what is the transition plan? How do we get there? So if there's a clear messaging in terms of the policy and implementation, I think it'll be good.
Great.
Just add that one of the risks as well from trying to decouple through punitive measures is that you'll find that other companies in Europe and Asia will kind of in turn decouple from American suppliers of inputs, and there'll be a spur to remove American kind of cogs from the supply chain. So there's a potential for that to backfire in that way.
Okay. Great. Well, I want to just give you a few minutes here to wrap up. Do you have any concluding thoughts to offer? Anything that you really want to emphasize from our discussion today, or that you didn't get to bring up about supply chains? And Damien, let's go to you first for some concluding thoughts.
I actually just have one comment, since we cover a lot of territory for people to digest. I would just say that, broadly speaking, whether it's supply chains or other economic issues, I think the most effective policy when it comes to other countries too is not to give them ultimatums, because that usually doesn't work well with other countries. The more effective strategy and policy is to give them options, and better options. And so, that's sort of where, from a U.S. perspective, is sort of what are the options we're giving. We talked a lot about, well, what's the China substitute? What's the East Asia substitute? Well, if there is a good one, I think it doesn't take a genius to figure out, well, we should go to the better substitute. So I think the option-based strategy is probably better than the ultimatum strategy for most countries.
So just really quickly, so I think there was an opportunity at the beginning of this new administration when it was started to reset the relationship with regard to China. But because of the coronavirus, it is not clear to see how it's going to be unfold. That's would be my quick comment, and really just highlighting, I think that is one of the key arguments from the macro polar report that you guys written, that just if we are trying to set the binary choice between like national security and economic security, I think it's going to be very challenging to the private sector. So again, agree with just giving options and what is the plans.
And I just emphasize from my reading of the last few decades that in the world of tech and innovation, unless you're constantly moving forward, you're almost guaranteed to fall behind. So any approach to American supply chain policy, I think, really can't lose sight of the importance of investing in American capacities for basic research, in America's access to global talent, and in fostering, a really broad-based innovation ecosystem in the United States.
All right. Well, thank you for a really fascinating and timely discussion today. I want to thank all of our panelists and the organizers to this event. Thank you for our audience members for joining us today. And again, that report that Damien and Neil wrote is available, shared in the chat here, as well as on the MacroPool website. Thanks again for joining us.